Welcome to our deep dive into some of the most difficult languages to learn. And yeah, I know difficult is subjective.
It totally is. What's a breeze for one person can be like climbing Mount Everest for another.
Exactly. But, there are some languages that are pretty consistently ranked as tough,
Yeah.
especially for us English speakers.
That's right. And we're not just going to list them off like a shopping list. We're going to really dig into why those challenges exist.
Yeah. So we've got all sorts of sources here talking about writing systems, crazy grammar, pronunciation,
Yeah.
the whole 9 yards. But honestly, sometimes it's not even the textbook stuff that trips you up.
Oh, tell me about it. You can be a grammar whiz and still totally miss the mark socially.
Right. Imagine messing up a simple greeting because you didn't understand the cultural nuances.
That's a whole other level of difficult right there.
Okay, so let's jump right in. First up, we've got what I'm calling the character crusaders, those languages where just reading the darn thing is a challenge.
You're talking about languages that don't use the Roman alphabet, the one we're used to in English.
Yep, like Mandarin Chinese. You've probably heard it's tonal, but what does that even mean?
Okay, so picture this. The word ma in Mandarin, one word, 4 tones, 4 completely different meanings. You could be saying mutter, horse, hemp, scold, all with the same ma, just different pitches.
Wow. Okay, so one wrong tone, and you're suddenly asking for a horse instead of your mom. That's a recipe for disaster.
Oh, absolutely. And that's just the tones. Then you add in the fact that Chinese uses thousands of characters, each one a unique symbol, not just a letter.
Oh, right. No nice, neat little alphabet to help you out there.
Yeah.
Speaking of characters, Japanese is similar, right? They use Chinese characters, but...
But they didn't stop there. Japanese has 3 writing systems. They've got kanji, borrowed from those Chinese characters, then hiragana, and then katakana.
Okay, wait. 3 different sets of symbols?
Uh-huh.
That's a lot to keep track of. And I've heard Japanese has, all these politeness levels, too.
It does. The way you speak depends on who you're talking to, the social situation. You use different verb forms, even different vocabulary, depending on how formal or polite you need to be.
So even if you can understand the words, you could still really mess up if you're not using the right level of politeness.
You got it. And that's a perfect example of how cultural stuff can be just as tricky as any grammar rule.
For sure. Okay, before we leave East Asia, gotta mention Korean. It's got its own alphabet, Hangul, which I've heard is pretty easy to learn, actually.
Hangul is definitely considered more straightforward than Chinese characters. It's pretty logical. But don't let that fool ya. Korean grammar can still throw some curveballs for us English speakers.
Really? Like what?
Well, the sentence structure is totally flipped. In English, it's subject, verb, object, I eat cake. But in Korean, it's subject, object, verb, so I cake eat.
Wait, so the verb comes at the end. That's wild.
Yep.
Takes some getting used to. And just like Japanese, Korean has those politeness levels too.
Mm.
So yeah, you might be able to read Korean quicker, but forming a sentence that's both grammatically and socially correct is a whole other challenge.
Okay, so we've tackled those character-heavy languages. Now, let's move on to what I'm calling the grammar gauntlet. Even I've heard about Russian cases, and they sound terrifying.
They definitely have a reputation. So in English, we rely on word order to tell us who's doing what, right? The dog bit the man is different from the man bit the dog.
Yeah, word order tells us who the biter is.
Exactly. But in Russian, they use these things called cases, which are like little flags on the end of nouns, to show their role in the sentence. So the word for dog, or man, will change its ending depending on whether it's doing the action, receiving the action, all sorts of things.
So instead of changing the order of words, they change the words themselves. That's crazy.
It is different, for sure, but it also means they can be more flexible with word order, because those case endings tell you what's going on. Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But how many cases are there, 6?
6 in Russian. Remember that story I told you about that guy trying to order coffee in Russia?
The one where he accidentally said, coffee wants me, instead of I want coffee?
That's the one. Cases can lead to some interesting situations if you're not careful.
Yeah, 6 cases sounds rough already, but it gets worse, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Buckle up, because we're heading to Finland now, the land of 15 cases.
15? Hold on. How can a language have 15 cases?
Well, Finnish takes this idea of cases and runs with it. Imagine not just changing the ending a little bit, but adding on all these extra bits to indicate things like location, direction, possession, even more abstract concepts like being inside of something or being without something.
So the words can get super long then.
Oh, yeah, it's called agglutination, and it can make some pretty crazy-looking words. And if 15 cases aren't enough, Hungarian has 18.
18. Okay, my brain officially hurts. So we've got Russian with its 6 cases, Finnish with 15, and Hungarian with 18. That's a lot of cases.
It is. Shows how differently languages can handle grammar, and how English speakers who aren't used to all that complexity can find it pretty darn challenging.
Okay, so, quick question. Why should I care about all this? Like, I'm not planning on becoming a linguist anytime soon.
That's fair, but even if you never master these languages, learning about them can teach you a lot about how language works. It makes you appreciate the diversity out there, how differently our brains can process information.
Huh. Never thought of it that way.
And honestly, I think it makes you a more empathetic communicator overall, even in your own language.
Interesting. Okay, so we've survived the character crusaders and the grammar gauntlet. Now we're on to my final group, which I'm calling the unique beasts. These are languages with quirks so specific they deserve their own category.
They don't fit neatly into just characters or grammar, but they've definitely got their own unique challenges for English speakers.
Ooh, intriguing. Which beast are we tackling first?
Let's start with a language that's practically a time machine. Icelandic. Imagine speaking a language that's barely changed since the Viking Age.
Wow, so it's like linguistic time travel.
Exactly. Icelandic has this really archaic grammar and tons of words that you just won't find anywhere else.
So it's like learning a secret code that only a handful of people know.
Kind of. But it's also really cool to connect with a language that's so deeply rooted in history. Speaking of unique linguistic landscapes, let's head to North America. Time for Navajo.
This one really challenges how we think about language.
How so?
Navajo is verb-centric, so in English, the verb is just one part of the sentence. But in Navajo, it's like the boss. He can get super complex, packed with all sorts of information about location, direction, all that stuff.
So like instead of separate words for all those things, they cram it all into the verb.
Exactly. It's like fitting an entire English sentence into a single Navajo verb.
Wow, that's amazing. And didn't I hear somewhere that Navajo is tonal too? You did. Just like Mandarin, the tone you use can change the meaning. So you've got this crazy complex verb system, plus the tones. It's a real challenge.
Okay, so we've got Icelandic, which is like speaking Viking, and Navajo, where the verb is king and the tones make it even trickier. What other beasts are lurking out there?
Well, let's finish up with one that'll give your tongue a workout.
Polish.
It uses our Roman alphabet, so you might think reading it's easy peasy.
I'm sensing a but coming.
You bet. Polish is famous for its consonant clusters. Imagine a bunch of consonants all crammed together, barely a vowel in sight. Oh, and then there are the nasal vowels, sounds we just don't have in English.
So even if you figure out the grammar, actually saying the words is a whole other battle.
Polish pronunciation can trip up even seasoned language learners. And to make things even more fun, Polish has 7 cases too.
7 cases. Tricky pronunciation. Polish sounds like a real linguistic workout. So, to recap our unique beasts, we've got Icelandic, basically ancient Viking talk, Navajo with its powerhouse verbs and tones, and Polish, the tongue twister with a case system to boot. Wow, we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive.
We have, from all over the globe, each with its own quirks and challenges for us English speakers. But difficult doesn't mean impossible.
Exactly. It's more about understanding why these languages are seen as tough and appreciating all the different ways humans communicate. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll keep digging into these fascinating languages and what we can learn from them, even if we never become fluent.
And we'll tackle some of your questions too. We know you've got them. We've barely scratched the surface of all the wild and wonderful things these languages throw at us. And, you gave us some awesome sources for this deep dive, so we're sticking to what you wanted to explore.
Yeah, it's not just about ranking them on some difficulty scale.
Yeah.
It's about appreciating how they reflect different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the world,
Absolutely. Take Arabic, for instance. We mentioned it briefly, but it's a great example of this thing called diglossia. Basically, there's a huge difference between the formal written Arabic and the everyday spoken Arabic in different regions.
You could learn formal Arabic, like read the news, maybe even write poetry.
And then go to a market in Morocco and be totally lost. The dialect there could have completely different pronunciation, grammar, even whole words that are different.
It'd be like learning Latin, so you could read ancient texts, and then going to Rome expecting everyone to talk like Caesar.
Perfect analogy. And even within a single language family, the variations can blow your mind. Think about the tonal differences within Chinese itself. We focused on Mandarin, but Cantonese, spoken in Hong Kong and parts of southern China, has 6 tones instead of 4.
Wait, 6? So all those mag examples we talked about earlier, there'd be even more potential for mix-ups in Cantonese.
Oh, yeah. Whole different tonal landscape to navigate. And while we're on the topic of variations, let's not forget about writing systems. We talked about the challenge of Chinese characters, but Arabic script, written from right to left, that throws its own curveballs.
Plus, the way those letters connect, all those beautiful flowing shapes, it's like calligraphy and a secret code all in one. But with all this talk of complex writing and grammar, it makes me wonder, what is it about English that makes all these features seem so hard for us?
That's a great question. English, it's a real mutt of a language borrowed from so many sources over the centuries. But somewhere along the way, it lost some of that grammatical complexity you see in languages like Finnish or Hungarian.
So, we don't have to worry about all those crazy cases or super long words with agglutination, so it just feels weird to us.
Exactly. It's like our brains are used to a certain level of linguistic simplicity. Then we hit these languages that break all the rules we're used to.
It's definitely a challenge. But I guess it's also a chance to, stretch our minds and see how differently people can communicate,
Absolutely. It's all about appreciating that diversity.
Speaking of challenges, I want to circle back to motivation for a sec. I mean, we've thrown a lot of linguistic curveballs at our listeners today, but ultimately, isn't passion the key? You got to be genuinely interested in the language and its culture to really succeed.
Oh, right, 100%. Motivation is everything. It's the fuel that keeps you going when you're wrestling with those Polish consonant clusters or trying to decipher Navajo verbs.
And speaking of Navajo, it's a great example of a language that's both super challenging and super connected to a rich cultural heritage. It's not just communication for them, it's like their history, identity, connection to the land.
It really highlights how language learning isn't just about vocabulary and grammar. It's about connecting with people, understanding their worldview, seeing how they express themselves.
And sometimes those expressions are so different from what we're used to in English that they can totally change how you understand an idea.
Oh, for sure. Think about the concept of time. In many European languages, time is seen as linear, right? Past, present, future. But in some indigenous languages, like Hopi, time is more cyclical, maybe even spiral, emphasizing how everything's interconnected.
Oh, that's a trip. It makes you realize how much our language can affect how we perceive something as basic as time.
Exactly. And that's just one example of how exploring other languages can really challenge our assumptions.
So anyone feeling inspired to start a linguistic adventure, I say go for it. Choose a language that truly sparks your interest.
Because, let's be real, the hardest language to learn is the one you never even try.
True that. But I got to admit, after all this talk about challenges, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Where do you even start with something like Finnish with its 15 cases or Navajo with its crazy verbs? It's like learning to think in a whole new way.
It can definitely feel that way. But every language learner starts somewhere. The key is to break it down into smaller steps. Don't try to learn everything at once.
So don't try to build the whole house in a day. Start with one brick at a time.
Exactly. Focus on the basics first. The alphabet, some key words, simple grammar rules. And remember, it's a journey, not a race. There'll be tough parts, but also those aha moments that make it all worth it.
Okay, that actually makes me feel better. It's about embracing the process, right?
Totally. And remember, there are tons of resources out there now. Apps, online courses, tutors, even language exchange partners. Experiment and find what works for you.
So even if I'm tackling one of these difficult languages, there's hope.
Absolutely. And even if you never reach perfect fluency, the process itself has benefits. Boosting your brain power, improving memory, even sparking your creativity.
Plus, it's a fantastic way to connect with new people and cultures. Speaking of which, have you ever had a moment where learning a new language totally changed your perspective on something?
Oh yeah, definitely. One that stands out was when I was learning Japanese. I was struggling with this concept called amai, which roughly translates to indulgent dependence, but it's way more nuanced than that. It doesn't really have a direct English equivalent.
Intriguing. Tell me more.
So in Japanese culture, ame is seen as a good thing, like a sweet kind of dependence between close people. It's about allowing yourself to be vulnerable, rely on others. But from an English-speaking perspective, it can come off as needy or clingy.
So learning that word helped you understand a different way of relating to people.
Absolutely. It showed me how even something as universal as relationships can be seen and expressed in totally different ways depending on the culture and language.
That's a powerful example of how language can shape our understanding. And it makes me think about all the other unique concepts out there just waiting to be discovered through language learning.
It's a journey of discovery for sure. I encourage everyone to embrace the challenge.
Okay, so we've talked about motivation, resources, cultural context, and even some tips for tackling those grammar and writing system hurdles. But let's be real, some of these languages, like Finnish with its 15 cases or Arabic with its diglossia, these still seem pretty intimidating. Any advice on how to make it less daunting?
For sure. One of the best things you can do is focus on your interests. If you're passionate about a culture, its history, its art, that passion will fuel your learning. So choose a language you're actually curious about, one you'll enjoy exploring.
That makes sense. If you're excited about the language, you're more likely to stick with it when it gets tough.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to immerse yourself as much as possible. Watch movies, listen to music, try cooking their food, anything that exposes you to the language in a fun way.
So it's not just about hitting the textbooks, it's about experiencing the language.
You got it. Immersion is key to fluency and really getting those nuances. And speaking of nuances, another tip is to pay attention to the cultural context.
What do you mean by that?
Well, language isn't just words and grammar. It's about how people use language in different situations. So pay attention to body language, tone of voice, even humor. All those things play a role.
So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly. And that's where cultural understanding comes in. By learning about their customs and values, you'll be a much better communicator.
That's awesome advice. But what about the more practical stuff? Like, how do you actually tackle those grammar challenges? How do you even begin to wrap your head around, say, Finnish cases or Arabic verb conjugation?
One strategy is to break down those big, scary concepts into smaller chunks. Like, don't try to learn all 15 Finnish cases at once. Start with the most common ones and gradually add more.
So kind of like building a house brick by brick.
Perfect analogy. And another helpful thing is to look for patterns and connections between different grammar concepts. For example, in Arabic, verbs follow certain patterns based on their root. Understanding those patterns makes conjugating new verbs way easier.
So it's not just rote memorization, there's actually logic behind it.
Absolutely. That's what makes language learning so cool. It's like solving a puzzle. Once you see those patterns, it gets much easier.
Okay, so some solid strategies for those grammar hurdles. But what about writing systems that are totally different from ours? Like, how do you even approach learning Chinese characters or Arabic script?
Well, a good starting point is to learn the basic strokes and radicals. Those are like the building blocks of characters. For example, in Chinese, lots of characters have a radical that gives you a clue about the meaning and a phonetic part that hints at the pronunciation.
So it's like breaking down a complex character into smaller pieces.
Yep. And as you learn those building blocks, you'll start to recognize patterns and make connections.
And I bet repetition is key, right? Just like with any language, the more you practice reading and writing, the more familiar it becomes.
You nailed it. Repetition and exposure are crucial. And luckily, there are tons of great tools now. Flashcards, apps, online dictionaries. It's not like the old days of just copying characters by hand for hours.
Well, some people might still enjoy that, but it's good to have options, for sure. And, even if you don't become a calligraphy master, just being able to recognize those characters and understand them is a huge win.
Absolutely. It's all about setting realistic goals and celebrating those little victories.
Great point. Okay, so we've covered a ton in this part of our deep dive. Motivation, resources, cultural context, even practical tips for tackling those grammar and writing system challenges. But I have a feeling we're just getting started. What other cool insights can we uncover from these difficult languages?
Well, one of the most fascinating things about language learning is how it can actually change the way we think. We talked about amai in Japanese and the concept of time in Hopi, but there are so many other examples of how language can shape our perception, memory, even problem-solving skills.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Give me another example. How can learning a new language change how you think?
Let's take grammatical gender. In lots of European languages, nouns are assigned a gender, either masculine or feminine. Like in French, table is feminine la table, but book is masculine le livre.
Right, and that always seems so random to me. Like, why does a table have to be feminine? What makes a book masculine? It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And that's where it gets fascinating. Studies have shown that people who speak languages with grammatical gender tend to associate those genders with certain characteristics. So a French speaker might unconsciously see la table as more delicate or elegant, while le livre might seem more strong or authoritative.
Whoa, so the grammar is actually affecting how they see these objects. That's wild.
It is, and it shows how language can shape our thinking in subtle ways. And it's not just gender either. Other features, like how a language describes space or expresses emotions, can also influence how we interact with the world around us.
So learning a new language is like gaining access to a whole new way of thinking.
You got it. It's like stepping into a different mental landscape. And while it can be challenging, it's also super rewarding.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this journey, haven't we? From those tonal languages to cases galore and even languages where the verb is like the star of the show.
It's amazing to think about, right? Just how diverse human language really is.
Yeah, and how much it tells us about different cultures and ways of seeing the world.
I mean, you think about it.
I know I started this deep dive feeling a little intimidated by all these so-called difficult languages, but now, honestly, I'm just fascinated.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going for, right? It's not about ranking them or anything. It's about appreciating how rich and complex human communication can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for you, dear listener? What if you're feeling inspired? You want to learn a new language, but you're a little scared at how hard it might be.
Well, I say embrace the challenge, embrace the stumbles and those aha moments when you finally get something or have your first real conversation.
It's all about the journey, right? Not just the destination. Even if you never become perfectly fluent, the process of learning a language can be so rewarding.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can open your mind to new ways of thinking, challenge your assumptions, and make you a more well-rounded person.
Totally. Now, before we wrap up this linguistic adventure, I want to leave you with a thought. What if everyone in the world spoke only one language?
I mean, sure, it might make things easier in some ways, but what a loss that would be.
Right. Think about it. All the different cultural nuances, the poetry, the unique ways of seeing the world that would just disappear.
It's that diversity of languages that makes human expression so beautiful and complex.
Couldn't agree more. So let's celebrate those differences, embrace the challenges, and keep exploring this amazing world of language.
One word at a time.
One phrase at a time.
One conversation at a time.
Beautifully said. And hey, who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one sharing your insights in these difficult languages and inspiring others to start their own adventures. Until then, happy learning.